My name is Sam, and I'm a summer camp counselor at Camp Willowbrook. The season ended 2 days ago. The buses hauled away the last of the screaming kids and the exhausted staff, leaving me behind for the shutter shift. It's my job to spend 1 week alone, winterizing the cabins, locking the equipment sheds, and ensuring the lakefront is secured. Willowbrook is beautiful in July. In late September, it's a graveyard of childhood memories. The colorful kayaks are stacked like rib cages under black tarps. The archery range is a row of straw targets that look like faceless men standing in the tall, yellow grass. The silence is the hardest part. Without the singing and the splashing, the woods feel like they're leaning in, reclaiming the clearings I thought we owed. Tonight, the wind was coming off the lake, carrying the scent of rotting lily pads and cold mud. I started my final sweep of the lower ring, the row of 6 cabins where the youngest boys stay. Each cabin is a simple wooden shell with screen windows and 4 sets of bunk beds. I carried my heavy lantern and a clipboard. My boots made a hollow thump on the wooden porch of cabin 1. Empty. The mattresses were stripped. A single lonely sock lay in the corner. I checked it off and moved to cabin 2. Empty. I found a friendship bracelet snagged on a splinter in the doorway. I pulled it off and put it in my pocket. By the time I reached cabin 4, the Bluebird cabin, the moon had been swallowed by a thick bank of clouds. The lake was a flat black mirror, the water hitting the shore in a rhythmic, wet slap. I pushed open the door to cabin 4. The hinges didn't creak, they screamed. I stepped inside, my lantern casting a long, distorted shadow of the bunk bed against the cedar wall. I walked to the back, checking the rafters for any forgotten gear. I stopped. The bottom bunk in the far corner wasn't empty. A wool blanket was tangled in a heap of the center of the mattress. I felt a surge of annoyance. Some kid had hidden his bedding to avoid the final laundry haul. I reached out to grab the blanket, intending to toss it into my lost and found bin. My hand touched the wool. It was warm. Not just left in the sun warm. It felt like body heat. I pressed my palm into the center of the mattress. The indentation was still there, the springs slowly creaking as they pushed back up against my weight. Someone had been lying here less than a minute ago. I spun around, the lantern light swinging wildly. The cabin was small, maybe 20 feet long. There was nowhere to hide. No closets, no chests. Just the bunks. I dropped to my knees and swept the light under the beds. Dust. A dead cricket. A rusted soda tab. Nothing else. I stood up, my brain hitching. I told myself it was a stray dog. Or maybe a hiker who'd found a way in. But the door had been latched from the outside. I looked down at the pillow. Sitting right in the center of the warm patch was a small, hand-carved wooden whistle. It was a stained, dark, oily brown item. I picked it up. It felt strangely heavy for its size, and the wood was slightly damp, as if it had been held in someone's mouth. I didn't blow it. Every instinct I had told me that making a sound would be an invitation. I backed out of the cabin, my eyes fixed on that warm bunk. I didn't turn my back until I was on the porch. I reached for the exterior latch to lock the door, but my hand stopped an inch away. On the screen of the door, there was a handprint. It wasn't made of dirt or mud. It was made of wet, gray silt from the bottom of the lake. The hand was small, the size of a 10-year-old boy's, but the fingers were unnaturally long, stretching across the entire width of the frame. I looked toward the lake. The slapping sound of the water had changed. It was no longer the wind pushing the waves. It was the sound of someone stepping out of the water. I turned my lantern toward the dock. The light didn't catch that far, but I saw a silhouette. Something was standing on the end of the wooden pier. It was short, the height of a camper, but it stood perfectly still, its arms hanging down past its knees. It was dripping. I could hear the water runoff hitting the wooden planks. Then, The figure raised its hand to its face. The silence of the woods was shattered by a low, mournful note. A whistle. It didn't sound like a toy. It sounded like a human throat trying to imitate a bird call. A wet, whistling wheeze that vibrated in my very teeth. The figure on the dog stepped off the edge. Not into the water, but onto the air. It didn't fall. It began to walk across the surface of the lake, its feet making heavy, solid clack noises on the water as if the liquid had turned to stone. It was heading straight for cabin 4, straight for me. I didn't wait to see its face. I bolted for the mess hall, the only building with a heavy deadbolt and a telephone. As I ran, I heard another whistle. This one didn't come from the lake. It came from inside the cabin I had just checked, and then another from cabin 1 and cabin 2. The head count wasn't 0. The camp was full, and I was the only one who didn't belong. I reached the mess hall, my lungs burning and my vision blurring from the sheer adrenaline. I slammed the heavy oak door shut and threw the iron bolt. The sound echoed through the cavernous room, bouncing off the stacked plastic chairs and the long, empty pine tables. The mess hall always felt like the safest place in Willowbrook. It was the heart of the camp, where we sang songs and ate loud, messy meals. But in the dark, with only my lantern throwing long, flickering shadows, it felt like a ribcage, large, hollow, and dead. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I didn't want to be a beacon. I moved toward the back office, my feet sliding over the floorboards. I needed the phone. I needed to hear a human voice, a dispatcher, a ranger, even a wrong number, anything but the wet, rhythmic slapping of the water outside. I grabbed the handset. I didn't even get it to my ear before I heard it. The dial tone was gone. In its place was a chorus. It was faint, sounding like it was coming from 1,000 miles away, but it was unmistakable. Dozens of wooden whistles were blowing in unison, a discordant, shrill harmony that made a thin line of blood leak from my nose. I dropped the phone. It dangled by its cord, swaying like a pendulum, emitting that tiny, muffled screaming. I backed away from the office and looked out the large observation windows that faced the lake. The clouds had parted slightly, allowing a sliver of cold, gray moonlight to hit the water. The lake wasn't empty. 100 yards out, where the water is deepest, something was breaking the surface. At first, I thought they were buoys. Then, I thought they were logs. But they were too symmetrical. They were heads. Dozens of them, perfectly still, just the tops of their skulls and their eyes visible above the black water. They were arranged in a perfect semicircle, all of them facing the mess hall, facing me. I realized then that the figure on the dog hadn't been a stray hiker or a trespasser. It was a scout, and the rest of the camp was waiting for their turn to come ashore. I knew I couldn't stay in the mess hall. The building was mostly glass and old wood. It wouldn't hold if they decided to move. My only way out was the old service road, but my Jeep was parked on the boathouse on the other side of the inlet. To get there, I had two choices. Hike the 2-mile perimeter trail through the dense hemlocks, or take the shortcut, a 3-minute row across the narrowest part of the lake. I looked at the woods. They were pitch black, and I could already hear the rustling of something moving through the dry brush. The lower ring cabins were in between me and the trail. The things in the bunks were already there. The water was my only chance. I grabbed the flare gun from the emergency kit behind the kitchen counter and a life vest I didn't intend to wear. I slipped out the back door, staying low, and crept toward the small pebble beach where the canoes were overturned. The air near the water was freezing. It smelled like ancient, stagnant things, the kind of smell that comes from a grave that's been underwater for a century. I slid a silver aluminum canoe into the water. The metal gave a sharp, piercing screech against the stones. I winced, freezing in place. The heads in the distance didn't move. They remained fixed, staring at the mess hall. They hadn't seen me slip away. I climbed in and began to paddle. I didn't use the traditional stroke. I kept the paddle in the water, feathering it to minimize the splashing. The canoe glided across the surface like a blade. When I reached the center of the inlet, the wind died down. The water became unnaturally still, like a sheet of black glass. I stopped paddling for a second to catch my breath. That's when I noticed the surface of the lake was covered in something. Thousands of small, dark objects were bobbing in the water. I reached out and picked one up. It was a wooden whistle. I looked around. They were everywhere. The lake was carpeted in them, all hand-carved, all stained that sickly dark brown. They bumped against the side of the canoe, producing an unsettling sound. I looked down into the water, hoping to see the bottom, but the lake was too deep here. I turned my lantern toward the depths, the beam cutting through the murky green. I didn't see fish. I didn't see weeds. I saw a camp. Deep beneath the surface, illuminated by my light, were rows of white tents. They weren't floating. They were staked into the slit of the lake floor. I saw a campfire ring made of bleached white stones, with a fire made of glowing bioluminescent moss. And around the fire, sitting on submerged logs, were the campers. They weren't children. They were things that had been underwater so long their skin had turned the color of a fish's belly, a translucent milky white. They were wearing tattered Willowbrook uniforms, the W logo faded and caked with algae. They weren't moving. They were all sitting perfectly still, looking up at the bottom of my boat. One of them, a figure in a counselor's shirt, stood up. It didn't swim. It walked along the bottom of the lake as if gravity was a suggestion. It looked up at me, and its mouth opened. A bubble of air escaped its lips, but it wasn't air. It was a whistle. The sound vibrated through the hull of the canoe, humming in my feet. Suddenly, the heads out in the main lake began to move. They weren't watching the mess hall anymore. They were turning. The semicircle was breaking. They were swimming toward me, their movements silent and powerful, cutting through the water like sharks. I dug my paddle into the water and hauled with everything I had. The canoe surged forward, but the whistles in the water were acting like a drag, clogging my stroke. I reached the halfway point where the first hand gripped the gunwale of the boat. It was a pale, 3-fingered hand with long webbed joints. The skin was sloughing off in wet gray ribbons. I didn't think. I took the paddle and slammed it down on the fingers. There was no crack of bone, just a soft, wet squelch like hitting a bag of mud. The hand didn't let go. Another hand appeared on the other side, then another at the stern. The canoe began to tip. I grabbed the flare gun. I didn't aim at the things in the water. I aimed at the boathouse on the shore, hoping to light up the area so I could see where to jump. I pulled the trigger. The red flare shot into the sky, hissing and sputtering. For 5 seconds, the entire lake was bathed in a garish, bloody light. I looked down. The water around my canoe wasn't just full of swimmers. It was a solid mass of bodies, hundreds of them, stacked on top of each other, forming a human bridge from the bottom of the lake to the surface. They weren't trying to drown me. They were trying to lift me up. As the flare died out, the canoe was hoisted out of the water. It sat atop a bed of pale, wet shoulders. They began to carry me, not toward the shore, but back toward the center of the lake, toward the deep. The canoe didn't wobble. It stayed unnaturally level as it rose, 3, 4, 5 feet above the surface of the lake. Beneath me, the sound was a wet, rhythmic squelching, the sound of hundreds of pale, waterlogged shoulders shifting to bear my weight. I looked over the side, and the sight turned my stomach to ice. The bridge wasn't a random pile of bodies. They were interlaced, their long, spindly limbs hooked onto one another like a chain of drowned paper dolls. In the dying red glow of the flare I'd shot, I saw their faces. They had no eyelids. Their eyes were just milky white orbs that had rolled back into their skulls, yet I knew they were all watching the bottom of my boat. They were taking me toward the center. In the middle of the lake, a dark shape was rising. It wasn't an island. It was the roof of a cabin, an exact rotting replica of the Bluebird cabin, dripping with black slime and draped in stinking curtains of lakeweed. It was being pushed from the depths by the sheer force of the things below. They were bringing their camp to me. I knew that if the canoe reached that, I would be put in the bunk, and I would never be dry again. I grabbed the heavy metal lantern. It was still hot, the kerosene sloshing inside. I didn't think about the risk. I only thought about the hands. I unscrewed the filler cap and poured the fuel over the side, drenching the pale, slick shoulders of the creatures carrying the bow. I struck a match. The fire didn't roar. The air was too damp for that, but it hissed into a bright blue-orange flame that licked across the oily surface of their skin. The reaction was instantaneous. The bridge didn't scream. They didn't have the lungs for it. Instead, they hissed. It was the sound of 1,000 tea kettles boiling over. The bridge buckled. The creatures beneath the fire recoiled, their grip failing as they dove back into the safety of the dark water. The canoe tipped violently. I was thrown into the lake. The water was so cold, it felt like being hit by a truck. It punched the air out of my lungs. I sank, my boots dragging me down towards the tents I'd seen on the lake floor. I looked down and saw them. Thousands of those pale figures standing on the bottom, their arms reaching up like a field of white kelp. I started kicking until my calf muscles cramped and my vision blurred with dark spots. I broke the surface, gasping, and began a frantic splash and crawl toward the shore. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see how close they were. I reached the pebble beach and scrambled up the bank, my wet clothes weighing 50 pounds. I didn't head for the boathouse. I knew they'd be waiting in the water there. I ran for the mess hall. I burst through the back kitchen entrance and slammed the heavy steel door. I didn't just bolt it, I shoved the heavy prep table in front of it. I was shivering so hard my teeth were clicking like castanets. I wrapped myself in a dry industrial tablecloth and sat on the floor, clutching a butcher knife I'd grabbed from the magnetic rack. The silence returned, but it was the wrong kind of silence. It was the silence of a theater before the curtain rises. Then I heard the bell. The old bronze camp bell sat on a wooden post in the center of the clearing. It was only used for 3 things: wake up, mealtime, and emergencies. It was the wake-up call, but it was 3:30 in the morning. I crawled to the window and looked out through a gap in the blinds. The lower-end cabins were no longer dark. In the windows of cabin 1, 2, and 3, I saw the flickering, bioluminescent green light of the moss I'd seen underwater. The doors to the cabins opened simultaneously. They came out in a line. The campers. They moved with a stiff, jerky gait, their wet clothes clinging to their skeletal frames. They didn't talk. They didn't whisper. They just marched toward the mess hall for breakfast. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering. "They can't get in," I whispered to myself, the words dying in the vast empty room. "The doors are steel. The windows are reinforced." Thump. Something hit the roof. Then another, and another. They weren't even trying the doors. They were dropping from the overhanging hemlock trees onto the shingles above my head. I heard the wet slap of bare feet running across the roof. Then came the sound of the whistles. It started as 1, low and mournful, then 10, then 100. The sound began to vibrate the industrial fans in the kitchen. It hummed in the copper pipes. It was so loud, the glass jars of spices on the shelves began to shatter, showering the floor in cinnamon and salt. I couldn't take the noise. It felt like my brain was being scraped out with a dull spoon. I ran for the only place in the mess hall that was windowless and soundproof, the walk-in freezer. I lunged inside, pulling the heavy insulated door shut behind me. The silence was immediate. The thick walls muffled the whistles until they were just a faint, ghostly hum. It was so cold, well below zero, but I didn't care. I huddled in the corner between two crates of frozen corn, hugging my knees. I sat there for what felt like hours. My breath came out in thick white clouds. My fingers were turning blue, and the shivering had stopped, which I knew was a bad sign. Hypothermia was settling in. I started to drift off, a heavy, peaceful sleep pulling at my eyelids. And that's when I heard it. It was a small sound, but in the silence of the freezer, it was like a gunshot. I looked at the door. The safety release, the glowing internal handle that is supposed to allow anyone to exit from the inside, was turning, slowly. But it wasn't being turned from the inside. I looked at the small circular frost-covered window in the door. A finger was rubbing away the ice from the other side. A long, pale, three-fingered hand. The frost cleared. It wasn't a face that looked in. It was a wooden whistle, held up to the glass by a hand that was dripping with lake silt. The door didn't open. Instead, I heard a wet, metallic hiss coming from the overhead cooling vents. I looked up. The vents weren't blowing cold air anymore. Water began to pour in. Ice cold, black lake water began to flood the freezer. It rose rapidly, swirling around my boots, then my knees. I scrambled to my feet, pounding on the door, but the pressure from the outside was too great. The water rose to my chest. It smelled of rotting lily pads and ancient graves. As the water reached my chin, I looked at the door one last time. Through the small window, I saw the mess hall. It was full of them. They were sitting at the tables, their milky eyes fixed on the freezer door, waiting for the activity to end. The last thing I felt was the wooden whistle floating up to my lips, bobbing on the surface of the rising water. I didn't have to blow it. The water did it for me. As the freezer filled to the ceiling, a single long note echoed through the pipes of Camp Willowbrook, signaling that the last bunk was finally occupied.